This is the second session in the series on the Four Noble Truths. Last time was an introduction and an overview, and I also spent a little time beginning the discussion on the First Noble Truth, which many people understand as saying life is suffering. That's not exactly accurate. There's actually a lot more to the meaning of it. And so we want to unpack that a little bit. The word that gets the Pali word that gets translated as suffering is dukkha. And dukkha has the meaning, the root meaning, or the etymology of the word is a cart in which the axle of the wheel is loose. And so when you ride on a cart with a loose axle, you get a bumpy ride. So one way to think of the First Noble Truth is saying that life is a bumpy ride. And other meanings of the word dukkha is that life has an aspect of being unreliable, right? Things just change, sometimes not uncontrollable. We can't totally control things. So this is the aspect of the real fuller meaning of what the First Noble Truth is saying about life is dukkha. And if we don't have a problem with the bumps, then we don't suffer. And of course, we all know that there's many aspects of life. Things change, we get certain things happen we don't like, or we can't get things we do like. And again, to the extent we can let that be, we're doing okay. But to the extent that, that's a problem, we're clinging or getting in reaction with it, that's when the dukkha is suffering. That's a little bit more of the meaning of the First Noble Truth. But there's even some more layers I want to tease apart a little bit. So I'll have to add a few more teachings in now to really help us understand the full meaning of the First Noble Truth. According to the Pali language, Pali Buddhist tradition, the story goes that after the Buddha's enlightenment, he went to give his first teachings to a group called the Five Ascetics. Before his enlightenment, the Buddha had engaged in a range of very extreme ascetic practices, including taking very little food and really practically starving himself. And in fact, you'll sometimes see a Buddhist statue, in which the Buddha's body is skeletal. That's the ascetic Buddha. And he realized that this wasn't giving him the results he wanted, and so he took enough nourishment, so his body had enough strength so he could practice, went in different directions around practice, his meditations and so forth, and then attained his liberation, his awakening, his enlightenment, whatever term you like. And so then he went and traveled and met with this group, the Five Ascetics, people who were still doing the same ascetic practices that he had been doing previously. And the teachings he gave were the discourse. The sutta is called Setting in Motion the Wheel of the Dharma. Again, according to the traditional account, it's the first teaching the Buddha gave, and it's on the middle way and the Four Noble Truths. The middle way is finding a balance between the extremes of asceticism on one side and on the other end, overindulgence in sense pleasures. So it's just finding a balanced way to live and be. And then the Four Noble Truths, and the tradition, the story tells us that one by one, the Five Ascetics gained their own enlightenment upon hearing and putting into practice these teachings. So to understand these more fully, I want to bring in what, according to tradition, is the second and third talks or teachings that the Buddha gave. The second is called the Teaching on No Self, and the third is called the Fire Sermon. Literally, the title translates as the way of speaking of things as if they are on fire. So let's go to this second discourse of the Buddha called the Teachings on No Self. So this is a tricky term. We hear that Buddhism says there's no self, or you'll hear non-self or not self. And it's typically, I think, quite misunderstood because Buddhism is actually not teaching that there's no self. We all have a self. I hope that's obvious in the ordinary, everyday sense. So the question more is, what's the nature of our self? In the time of the Buddha and to today, there are texts in the yogic traditions called the Upanishads. And in these, the Upanishads teach that the fundamental ultimate reality, or you could say the foundational or fundamental ground of existence or ground of being, is what's called Brahman. And Brahman is said to have three characteristics which are called Sat Chit Ananda. Sat is existence, Chit is consciousness, and Ananda is bliss. So the nature of Brahman is its existence itself, pure consciousness itself, pure bliss itself. And so Brahman, you would think about it, it's just sort of the ultimate, again, the ultimate fabric from which all existence, underlying reality of all existence. It would be similar to, in some traditions, using different language about trying to say what's the nature of God. It would be kind of like that. So that's Brahman, and it's universal. And then each individual has what's called the Atman, which is the individual soul. And the Atman has the same characteristics, Sat Chit Ananda, and is said to be one with Brahman. The idea being that we are an individual manifestation of the greater ultimate reality. So it's said you realize that Atman and Brahman are the same, that one. So that sometimes you'll hear language in the yogic tradition of being one with God. It doesn't mean your ego is God, but our ultimate sort of the essence of our being is connected with or comes out of the ultimate reality. So that's the idea of this thing called the Atman. It's your permanent eternal soul. So Atman is in Sanskrit. If you put an A in front, it's a negation. Anatman means no soul. In Pali, the word Atman is Atta, and put a negation in front, Anatta. So the word in Pali that gets translated as no self is Anatta, means no, saying no Atman. But even that is not exactly accurate. There is a well-known teaching in the Pali texts, which is called the simile of the poisoned arrow. Someone comes to the Buddha with all kinds of metaphysical questions. Included among them are questions about the nature of the soul. Is it eternal? A lot of questions like this. And the Buddha's reply in this teaching is that the Buddha says he knows, but he doesn't teach that. He's not going to comment on that. And he says all he teaches is the Four Noble Truths. And then he says, why? Why not answer those questions about more the metaphysical questions about the nature of the soul? And the Buddha uses an example. It's as if someone had been shot with a poisoned arrow. And before they would let the surgeon remove the arrow and the poison, they had all these questions they wanted answered first. What's the nature of the soul? And all these other metaphysical questions. About the poisoned arrow. The questions are, who shot me with the arrow? Why'd they shoot me? What material was the bow or the arrow made out of? Those were the questions. And the Buddha says, before you could answer all those questions, the person would die. And even if you could answer them all, it wouldn't help you because what's needed is to get the arrow and the poison out. Similarly, what's needed is to address the root cause of the human suffering, which is the Four Noble Truths. And so the idea really, when you hear Buddhism talking about no self, anatta, it's not actually trying to make a comment about whether there's an eternal soul or not. It's actually trying to tell us that anything you can experience and know about yourself isn't a permanent eternal soul. It's all changing. Yourself, in the way we can access it, every part of yourself, is just a changing process. That's the nature of the self. So I feel like the word self is actually a poor word to use for no anatta, but we're kind of stuck with it because everyone uses it, so it's fine to use it. We just want to be clear on what we mean when we use the term. So there is a model that's used in to help us get to this anatta. Really, the whole idea of it is just to help us not cling to this changing process. That's the idea. This is called the five aggregates. The aggregates, the term in Pali is khandas, and in Sanskrit it's skandhas. And the word khanda means bundles or heaps. You could say groups. So I'll just quickly go through these so you've heard it, so it'll help us understand, to help us get back to a deeper sense of understanding the First Noble Truth. You don't have to remember all this. And if you are around the meditation or the Dharma world for any length of time, you'll hear many talks on the five aggregates, and it's easy to do a search and find lots of talks and writings about it. So if you want to study it more, you can, but again, not necessary. And so let me name them. I'll give the Pali also with the English. You don't need to know the Pali, but some of you may be interested. So the first of the five aggregates in Pali is rupa. Rupa means form, it referring to the physical body. Well, we all know that the body is impermanent, it's changing, and we know that, right? It gets sick, it gets old, eventually will die. So clinging to the body in any particular way we want it to be is not a good strategy for happiness, and it's a setup for potential suffering. That's kind of the idea around this non-clinging. We don't push away or disassociate or detach from the body, but it's about not clinging to the body. So we find a way of being in relationship to the body where we let it be and find a peaceful relationship or an equanimous relationship with the body. That's the first aggregate, rupa, the body. The second in Pali is with a V, Vedana. And sometimes you'll hear it with a W, Vedana. That's just a Burmese accent, but V, Vedana. And it's translated as feeling or feeling tone. It's a little tricky because it doesn't mean feelings in the sense of moods or emotions. It refers to the pleasant, unpleasant, or sometimes they call it neutral. It doesn't mean neutral, but it's neither pleasant nor unpleasant. It's in between. All experiences are either pleasant, unpleasant, or maybe kind of just in between somehow. We could say neutral. That's an aspect. Well, we know that's always changing also. The third aggregate in Pali is sunya, and it refers to what we call perception. Perception is a quality in which our minds or our brains takes sense input and assembles it and gives it meaning and name. And I'll just use an example. If you look behind me, there's a bookshelf, and on some of the shelves are, for example, if you look right there is a Buddha statue, there's a plate, here's another decorative plate. If I ask you to look and say, like, look at one of the plates, what do you see? I think most people will say, well, I see a plate. You don't actually see a plate. What you see is color, shadow, shape, patterns of light landing on the retina. That's it. And then your mind or your brain assembles that and goes, oh, that's plate. Now, we don't notice that happening. It's happening so quickly, but we're doing that with everything around us all the time. In that way, we're assembling raw sense input and literally creating our experience of the world, of ourselves and the world. This teaching, this model on perception is not trying to make an ontological truth statement about whether there's actually any reality out there or not, but it's talking about how we create our experience of things. And as you can see, perceptions can change. I won't get into that in too much now, just for the sake of time, but sometimes we can misperceive things. And the idea is we can create a lot of suffering by assembling a reactivity or some view about what things are or how things are. And it may not be accurate, and also things change. I should mention, I'll continue with the other two aggregates in a moment. You could have created other models for what it is to be a human being, but I don't know how this one came to be, but this is just this particular model. So we have the body. Number 2, we have feeling tone, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. Number 3, perception. The fourth one in Pali is sankharas. This is a big one. It gets translated a lot of different ways, sometimes called volition or volitional action, intention, sometimes concoctions where we make up stories in the mind. I think of it as it includes all the mental activity that's not part of the other aggregates. We can call that sankharas, the fourth. And then the fifth, we can say that's changing all the time. The fifth is consciousness. Some people might say, well, consciousness doesn't seem to be changing so much. It has more of a persistence or a unchanging. But actually, we have in the English language the word unconscious. We can be unconscious. If you've ever had surgery, general anesthesia, you're unconscious. Where's consciousness then? We could have a philosophical discussion about it, but experientially, it's changed. It's gone. You're unconscious. You could have accidents and injuries, illnesses. So these 5 aggregates we see are impermanent. All those aspects. Notice it's not talking about is there underlying eternal soul, this Atman. It's just not bringing that into the discussion at all. If we can learn to let go around and not cling to any of it as self, that's the idea. When it says don't cling to something as self, it just means don't cling to things. They don't have to add in as self. Just we don't cling or hold on to things or get too identified with things. If I get too identified with my youth, that's a setup for suffering as the body inevitably ages, for example. So that's an idea of why they use the term don't cling to it as an identity or don't cling to it as self. So that's this second discourse on not self. It's specifically saying if you cling to any of the 5 aggregates as self, it creates suffering, and we can have non-clinging, more of a sense of allowing or letting be, or you could say meeting what's happening with it more of an equanimity, a non-reactivity. That's more for our well-being. So that's the teaching in this second discourse on the teaching on non-self, and you'll see later how it comes directly back into really fully informing it's really this thing on the aggregates is contained right there in the Pali languaging of the First Noble Truth. Okay, so we've got that model about the 5 aggregates. There's a second model. This is the last piece I'll bring in for this session, and then the next session we'll pull it all together. There's one more model that comes into play in the third discourse, the fire sermon. I know there's a lot of these lists and models, and as I mentioned for the 5 aggregates, you don't have to memorize or know these, but it's good to just have heard it. So this model used in the fire sermon is what's called the 6 sense bases, or the 6 senses if you want to just talk about it like that. And what they are the normal 5 senses of seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting. The 5th sense, they use the term touch. It just means the physical body sensations. So the normal 5 senses. And then the 6th in this model is called the mind. It's a doorway. They call it the ear door, the eye door, the tongue, the nose door. That's because it's a doorway through which we receive sense experience. So the mind door, the 6th, is another way we have mental experience. In this model, that's what they've done. There's 6 sense doors here. And quite simply, they use a metaphor, if you will, as if being on fire. And the idea is that they talk about, there's another model called greed, hatred, and delusion. And what that just means is greed is a euphemism, it's a generalization for the wanting mind. And so greed is a strong term, but it can refer to very, very strong wanting, craving, or even a light touch, but it's that things are pleasant, we want more of those. The greed, hatred is another euphemism for just wanting to get away from something or get something away, push something away from us that's unpleasant, that we don't want. And the greed, hatred, and then delusion takes many forms. It's sort of it can be misperceiving things. It can be a dullness that doesn't notice things, a lack of clarity. There's a range of ways that we can understand delusion. And so, in relationship to each of these 6 senses, if there's greed, hatred, or delusion, it's a setup. It's like burning on fire with suffering. That's the image. Sometimes our suffering or our discomfort isn't so strong that maybe fire is a little strong of an image. But we know that we can have really bad suffering where we can, for example, there's a phrase, burning in anger, right? So let's just take an example of using the sense of seeing, the eye door. If you see whatever it is that is horrible or terrible or you really, really hate or don't like or is problematic in some way, and we get into a reactive stance with it, that's the hatred, right? The aversion. It can feel like we're on fire, right? We're not at peace. So with any of the senses, it's just saying when we fall into greed, hatred, and delusion with seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touch in the body, anything mental in the mind, it's like being on fire, metaphorically. Similarly, when any of the senses arise and we're not falling into greed, hatred, or delusion, we're in non-clinging, more of finding a way of being, more of a sense of allowing or with a presence that's a non-reactive presence, it's not suffering. That's the idea of this fire sermon. So that's enough for this session. Next time, we won't name them all again, but you'll see how both this image of as if suffering, as if being on fire, and the 5 aggregates will come to play and help us really, really tease out more fully the meaning of the First Noble Truth.